Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I hope everybody had a good Memorial Day long weekend. If you had one, I actually had an anti-Semitic incident over the weekend. Someone hurling anti-Semitic abuse at me on the street. I will tell you that story later in the show. But I also came back from the break to realize that the treasonous and seditious tentacles of the Trump administration continue to grow and spread. Donald Trump's indicted and pardoned former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has been caught on video saying that a coup like what happened in Myanmar should happen in the United States, presumably against the Joe Biden administration. Now, this is not some random, QAnon shaman wearing a weird hat saying it. This is a former national security advisor to the president of the United States. Flynn said this Sunday night during a Q&A session at a conference called the For God and Country Patriot Roundup in Dallas, Texas. There is a little detail here that is just perfect, which is that the person asking Flynn the question doesn't even know that it's Myanmar. Instead, he says Myanmar. Like, every detail is harebrained. The focus is Flynn's answer, of course, but even the question is just, you couldn't write this stuff.
I'm a simple Marine. I want to know why what happened in Myanmar can't happen here.
No reason. I mean, it should happen here. No reason. But that's right. One more.
It should happen here, says a former national security advisor to a president of the United States. What happened in Myanmar, or Myanmar, as he said? A coup in Myanmar started on the morning of February 1st this year, when democratically elected members of the country's ruling party, the National League for Democracy, were thrown out. They were deposed by the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's military, which then vested power in a stratocracy. And the country's military executed a morning raid. They detained the elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, and other political figures. The military said what we did is right because there was voter fraud allegation in the Myanmar November election. So the link is, of course, the analogy they claim exists with voter fraud, stealing the election from Donald Trump in our November of 2020 election, which they therefore use to justify what Michael Flynn says. There should be a coup and Joe Biden should be deposed, should be forcibly removed from the White House. Now, remember that these are the very people, the loudest ones, screaming about how they are patriots. They have no actual respect for the Constitution, however. They are the loudest ones screaming about, we are for the rule of law. It must be law and order, but they have no respect for the rule of law. They are attacking us from within. Now, as a practical question, is this beyond the limits of free speech because it's an incitement to violence? A retired general that is so clearly a traitor. And there is a key difference here between the modern left and the modern right. And it's important to talk about. And when there are when you can't tell the difference between left and right, we point it out. But where left and right couldn't be more different, we also point that out. When the people I vote for lose an election, I don't like it, but I don't say, let's overthrow the government. Even when for years the Russia probe looked at whether Donald Trump was helped by a foreign power in 2016, all of that stuff, the left wasn't saying, let's do a violent insurrection to remove Donald Trump. And by the way, as far as Flynn goes, who is even paying Michael Flynn now? Does he have a pension from the military? If so, shouldn't this lead to you losing your pension? Is he getting paid for these one-off appearances? Is someone funding what he's doing? And who even would want to do that at this point in time? Not the best people, that's for sure. And this is why downplaying January 6th is so dangerous. If you downplay the importance of January 6th, it makes escalation more likely. It welcomes the escalation And when you hear a statement like this from Michael Flynn, it shows that Republicans have truly learned nothing from the January 6th Trump riots. And not only that, it's actually an escalation of rhetoric. And it's hard to know what the right really sees as the next step here with this stuff. And in a sense, what Republicans have learned from January 6th so far, because, look at what's taken place so far. They've learned that nobody's really going to stop them. And it's not even clear there will be consequences if they do another version of January 6th. So now the trend that we're seeing is those who have claimed for years to be about law and order, and those who for years have pointed fingers at Antifa and Black Lives Matter and eco-terrorists and the violent left, or whatever the case may be. Those are the people who now are regularly calling for violence over the last few weeks. And I want to take a moment and look at that trend now with this additional example of Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. So we are seeing a trend of more and more Republicans calling for violence while claiming that the left is violent, claiming that they're for law and order, claiming people must follow the rules, claiming people must listen to police, and blah, 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 all this stuff. OK, we now have had 3 what I would consider prominent calls to violence from notable Republican figures within the last week or two. And this is just the last, again, it's like 10 days or something like that. And this is, forget about the fact that if you visit the right wing pro-Trump enclaves of the internet, it's thousands and thousands of individuals doing it as well. I'm focusing here on the fact that there are prominent to semi-prominent right-wing figures that are now seemingly comfortable publicly saying we should do violence, we should do coups, we should do insurrections, we should do the Second Amendment stuff in order to protect this or to protect that. Okay, let's start. We looked at this one last week or the week before. Fox News propagandist Tucker Carlson calls for a real insurrection, the framing, the allusion there being alluding to January 6th wasn't a real insurrection, but we probably should have a real one. Remember, this was about completely incorrect claims about immigration from Tucker's guest, and this is how that went down.
That the people coming north from Latin America, Central America, in a lot of cases, are aware that there's a new administration in the United States and the policies are different?
Oh, most definitely. They're telegraphing it down there. When you see T-shirts with people say, Biden, let me in. Biden let me in. They're all over. I mean, it's telegraphed back down there. One of them comes over and they'll tell you. As soon as I get over and get through, I'm calling back home and I'm telling 10 more to come that I got in. Come on. We're sending a message that, hey, the border's open. Come on in. Do what you want. I mean, why aren't we enforcing the laws that are on the book? That are already on the book that says you can't cross that border illegally or whatever. But yet we're going to reward you with putting you in a nice hotel or give you a $1,400 Visa card, debit card that you can use while you're here in the States, till you get established or whatever. And how many times do they replenish it?
What do you mean, giving a $14 Visa debit card?
I haven't been able to confirm this yet, but I have told that they're giving you, these immigrant families, they're in these hotels, they're giving them a $1,400 Visa card. That they can
why don't we have a real insurrection at some point? Like, why would we put up with this?
Well, in my opinion, you're closer than you've ever been in our country of getting to that. I think we're closer.
Well, I feel closer to that. I mean, this is absolutely, it's beyond insulting.
That's the type of thing that is actually illiberal, anti-democratic, authoritarian escalation that we've been talking about. That's a perfect example right there. So there's Tucker Carlson. Then we had Matt Gaetz, the beleaguered and disgusting Congressman Matt Gaetz, said that we have an obligation. This was an event a few days ago. They, I guess, have an obligation to use the Second Amendment in armed rebellion. They must do it. Here is Matt Gaetz.
Maybe if you just conform to their way of thinking a little more, that you'll be allowed to participate in the digital world. Well, you know what? Silicon Valley can't cancel this movement or this rally or this congressman. We have a Second Amendment in this country, and I think we have an obligation to use it.
Nice one, right? I mean, listen, this is the guy who says it's not okay to cancel someone. Twitter bans are over the line, but shooting others dead, that's okay. That's a completely different thing, and that's something that he is going to talk about. As Congressman Adam Kinzinger said about that, quote, "This is why we need a January 6th commission. 4 months after an insurrection at the Capitol, we're hearing this language at another rally where so-called leaders are stoking fears and anger and inciting violence." Adam Kinzinger is completely correct. And then we have the clip we looked at in the first segment on today's show, and I'll play it again for you just to have it all here together. Donald Trump's former national security advisor, former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, calling for a coup to be done against Joe Biden at an event on a Sunday evening.
I'm a simple Marine. I want to know why what happened in Myanmar can't happen here.
You know, yeah, no reason. I mean, it should happen here. No reason. But that's right. One more.
A former national security advisor calling for the forcible removal of a president there. I still can't get over Myanmar. They don't even know. Myanmar, Myanmar. They don't care what it's called. They don't need to know anything about it. As long as they can use it somehow to point to we should forcibly remove Joe Biden. These are calls to violence, period. That's what they are. They have to be called what they are. The movement that insists we have to call things what they are, that's them. Call this what it is. Just call it what it is. A sitting congressman attempts to incite acts of terror. A former national security advisor encourages a coup. One of the most watched right-wing propagandist media hosts adopts the language of January 6th and says, let's do it for real this time. The January 6th one wasn't really an insurrection, but how about a real insurrection? And the right continues to just edge and push and prod and encourage their people towards launching some version of what might look like a civil war. Now, in all seriousness, maybe not with the Tucker Carlson example, but certainly with the Michael Flynn example and the Matt Gaetz examples, shouldn't the FBI be paying these guys visits? And I'm not saying the FBI should harass people or look into people for political reasons. What I mean is, if normal people said this kind of stuff publicly, it might actually be something that gets them a visit from law enforcement or from federal agents. Why is that not even in the picture when it comes to Michael Flynn and Matt Gaetz? And then, of course, as I mentioned before, is Michael Flynn getting some kind of pension from the military? And if so, don't statements like these call into question whether he should be receiving that pension? And aside from the political piece, they're saying this stuff as we have just mass shooting after mass shooting in the United States. They barely even make headlines anymore. One big one last week in San Jose did make headlines, but in the week prior, I think there were something like 18, was it 14 or 18 mass shootings? I don't know where most of them were. They don't even make headlines because it's just constant. And then here is just another angle on this, not necessarily ginning up the person-to-person violence that often is what we see in mass shootings, but just generally building up this idea of let's use violence. Let's use violence to solve personal problems. Let's use violence to solve political problems. And hey, if we bring guns in, as Matt Gaetz said, even better because we have the Second Amendment, and that's exactly what it should be for. Incredibly dangerous stuff, disgusting stuff. But listen, if you're these people, if you're these right wingers, who's going to hold you accountable? No, we can't make any progress on gun laws. It's not really seeming like, okay, there's individuals being prosecuted for their role in the Trump riots, but systemically, is there going to be any consequence? It doesn't seem like it. Why wouldn't you do it? Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Let me know your thoughts about this. And also make sure you're subscribed to the new YouTube channel. Yes, davidpakman.com/PakmanLive. New YouTube channel, totally different content. I'm inviting you in. What if you could read 10 books in just one sitting. That's exactly what one of my favorite apps lets you do. It's called Blinkist. And what they do is take thousands of popular nonfiction books. They condense them down into text or audio that you can consume in 15 minutes. Blinkist makes sure that you're getting all of the important core insights from each book. So it's perfect for exploring a book you otherwise wouldn't have time for. If there's a full book you're thinking about buying, you can use Blinkist to get a sample first. Just think how much you can enrich yourself by being able to soak up an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. I recently read A Brief History of Time, of course, by the great Stephen Hawking. This is a book that I have been aware of for so long, and other things got in the way, and it was fantastic to check it out on Blinkist. Blinkist has books on politics, philosophy, science. They have 27 different nonfiction categories, and a subscription is only about $8 a month, and you get the entire library. But you can try it totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've put the link right underneath this video. The David Pakman Show, of course, is funded mostly by great people like you who sign up at joinpakman.com. If you wanted to take advantage of the Memorial Day special and you forgot or you missed the email or whatever, the code is Memorial21. The discount is so aggressive, I'm embarrassed to even say what it is on the show, so I won't, okay? But that's the code, Memorial21. You can use it on the membership of your choice at joinpakman.com. All right, I have to admit something to you. I was completely wrong last year when I wrote off this QAnon conspiracy nonsense as a minor, passing, transient, insignificant movement of no consequence whatsoever. And my mistake was I overestimated the intelligence of the American people. And this is not a country where you can do that and end up correctly assessing what's going on. When you overestimate the intelligence of the American people, you end up with Trump as president, right? You say, even Republicans are never going to make this guy their nominee. Oh, but they did. Well, even Americans are not going to allow this guy to become president. Like, enough people will come out to vote to, oh, he's the president. You get burned and you end up very wrong. And case in point, QAnon conspiracy theories have caught on to the point that 20% of Americans, 1 in 5 Americans, believe at least one QAnon conspiracy theory right now. They may not consider themselves Q-Anoners or whatever they call themselves. They may not even know the origins of some of these conspiracies, but at least 20% of Americans believe one or more of these conspiracy theories. PRRIIFYC did a study that was conducted during March. It was just released late last week. 15% of Americans agree with the QAnon statement that the United States government, media, and financial worlds, quote, are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. You go to the supermarket, there's about 100 people in there. Statistically, 15 of them believe this. Now, of course, if you're in Connecticut versus if you're in Alabama, it's not going to be exactly 15 out of 100, but on a national level. 20% agree with the statement. There is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. 20% believe that. 15% of Americans agree that, quote, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. And this relates to what I said earlier about the right is increasingly vocal and willing to just straight up call for violence and say violence, guns, etc. may or will be needed. This means that in total, if you talk to 5 random people on the street, 1 likely believes some of these ideas. Now, it's very regionalized. If you do it in New York and Massachusetts, it's not going to be 1 out of 5. If you go to Georgia and South Carolina, it's going to be more than 1 out of 5. But on average, around the United States, 1 in 5 people believes at least one of these. I don't even want to call them theories. Not surprising findings are that those who trust far-right news outlets like OAN and Newsmax are more likely to believe this stuff. White evangelicals are more likely to believe this stuff, and Hispanic Protestants are more likely to believe this stuff than Americans in general. Now, the Hispanic Protestants one is scary. You guys may remember that right around the election, I did a full season. I think it was I think it was 12, 13 episodes of a show like mine, but in Spanish. And it was American politics, but in Spanish for Spanish speaking American residents. And the amount of conspiracy stuff that I got was stunning. And even in some groups I'm in, WhatsApp groups and others, Spanish speaking groups, there's a lot of this stuff shared, disproportionately high. If you're wondering, how did we get to this point where 20% of Americans believe at least one of these conspiracies? It was a long process. Decades of the Republican war on education. You had this anti-intellectual movement in the United States with multiple, I guess we would call them fronts or battle lines. You had attacking education and teachers as being liberal indoctrination, attacking college as being liberal indoctrination, underfunding public education at the state level. That's one front. Starting to attack the credibility of scientists and other experts. We saw this with climate science. That's a big, big deal. Same movement that said, during the, must have been 70s, smoking's not actually bad for you. This type of thing, right? Just creating a narrative that's anti-science, promoting the idea of the wisdom of the masses so that when something is popular, they can point to it and say, this many people wouldn't be wrong. And then, of course, the huge infrastructure of right-wing political news media. And I've talked about this for so long. They blur the lines between opinion and news. They always have a counter narrative. They place what should be nonsense conspiracies relegated to some website. They place at the equivalent level on debates on Fox News and Newsmax and OAN and talk radio. And this has been the package that we've seen as the Republican Party has gone from starting to get a little bit racist during the civil rights era to Reagan and starting to be anti-lazy welfare people, and then Gingrich in the early 90s further radicalizing them and getting away from policy and starting to get towards personal attacks. George W. Bush, the kind of dim-witted dude who was starting to go in the direction of making the Republican Party really a party of cultural values rather than policy. Obama comes in and the racism coalesces, and then we get Trump and we get Trumpian insanity and what we get now. So that's like 45 years. Understand that. The great sci-fi writer Isaac Asimov said, quote, "There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there has always been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge." Very appropriate for what's taking place in the United States right now. Now, I don't think people are willfully stupid. Not most people. It's a sort of death of a thousand cuts type situation. The news itself on right-wing media gets more and more cultish. The advertisements are increasingly scams. Alex Jones is selling supplements and weird cures. Fox News is selling pillows and gold bars. All of this stuff requires some gullibility. The ads you see on these channels and the so-called news you see on these channels. And then it just goes and goes and goes further. And then you get a candidate like Trump who says, let's coalesce all of the slightly gullible people and put them together. And then that'll bring in even more gullible people who say, hey, look, all these people can't possibly be wrong if they like it. So these are folks who have completely lost their grip on reality, completely and altogether. And that's really difficult to recover from. I'm not proposing solutions here because I don't know what the solution is, but that's the problem. And here's how it's now manifesting. I have absolutely huge breaking news for you. One of the biggest stories out there. New details have emerged about Hunter Biden's laptop emails. Just kidding. I'm not an idiot. But over the Memorial Day holiday, Fox News really did pretend to break this explosive story about a conspiracy theory related to the president's son, who has nothing to do with his administration whatsoever. Check this out. It was maybe not surprisingly on Fox and Friends. Here we go.
New details emerging in the Hunter Biden scandal.
Email reportedly show a meeting between his then vice president father, Joe Biden, and Hunter's business partners from around the world.
Yes, so we must have had a lot of translators there in two separate dinners that are chronicled in his laptop as it becomes leaked out more and more. Tad Pyro joins us live as the plot thickens and his dad's presence as vice president, very present.
Can you believe that, guys? Now, if you were paying attention all along, you'd know that they already did this supposed exclusive in October of 2020. It's now 7 or 8 months old when Fox reported about, quote, Hunter's ex-partner recounts meeting Joe Biden, claims family paranoid about hiding former VP's involvement. It was a non-story outside of the Fox Newsmax conspiracy universe because there was no actual evidence of anything untoward happening. It's sort of not shocking that if it's true that Joe Biden met people that his son worked with, that would be something that takes place. And this is what they cheered on about Trump. Trump made deals and his kids are involved and everybody's so good at business and Trump helps his kids and blah, 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 blah. Isn't everybody so great at everything? But now, if indeed it happened with Joe Biden, then it's definitely bad. It's definitely very, very bad. Let's look at a little bit more of this from the Fox and Friends report.
And there's two separate meetings there. Thanks, Todd.
Then how does he explain the email of one of the guys at that dinner thanking him, an executive from Burisma thanking Hunter Biden for introducing him to his dad?
We get details. It's in the New York Post today. Miranda Devine's got a book that's coming out in September. It's called Laptop from Hell. What's really curious.
Okay, now, did you see what Steve Doocy did there? This is a really important propaganda technique to understand. You know how sometimes Fox News will insert opinion into news shows by reporting on what Tucker said the night before, and then they react to what Tucker said during the opinion show as if it's news that Tucker said it. That's one technique Fox uses to blur the lines between opinion and news reporting. The New York Post has now run multiple discredited stories on the Hunter Biden laptop, and the New York Post is owned by News Corporation, which also owns Fox News. So remember this, the first Hunter Biden story back in October was published despite Fox News saying, we're not going to touch it. And even some reporters at the New York Post saying we really shouldn't publish this crap. It was widely reported on, including by the New York Times, as we're putting up on the screen for you. And at the time, Fox did the same. They reported on the New York Post story in order to be able to talk about it without running the report themselves, which they said, we can't run this. This is trash. Fox decided, let's just run the fact that the New York Post reported on it. And then that allowed them to do a week of coverage. Here, it's basically the same thing. Steve Doocy holding up the newspaper from the New York Post with the story. So, of course, with this new article, we'll see whether the claims are even true. But remember that the track record from the Post on these stories is highlighted by a Salon article from October. Fox News rejected Hunter Biden expose. New York Post writer refused to put his name on it. But then Fox News did weeks of coverage based on the very New York Post reporting that Fox News said, we can't actually run this. This is no good. This is how they do it. This is a technique you have to understand. And it's important that as a savvy media consumer that we should all aspire to be, we not only identify the difference between this is a news report and this is opinion, and of course they deliberately blur that to make it difficult, but we also are able to distinguish this is a news report based on a confirmed news report, or this is a news report based on something that is essentially gossip. And that's an important distinction to be able to make as well. So we'll have more on this on our Instagram. Make sure you're following us on Instagram at David Pakman Show. And while you're at it, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. New backyard garden tour. Some people get mad. Someone wrote to me saying, David, how dare you show us those disgusting stinkweeds in your backyard? Most people liked it, though. So there will be a new garden tour on my Instagram, david.pakman. The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%, BETTER21. It is a real pleasure to welcome to the program today Noam Chomsky, one of the most renowned intellectuals of our time and author of over 25 books, including Chomsky for Activists, Universalizing Resistance. Professor, it's so great having you on today. I appreciate it.
Very pleased to be with you.
So I would love to start by getting your thoughts about how the current state of the American right and the Republican Party got to where it is today. There's this line that is sometimes traced that goes back to anger stemming from the civil rights movement into the Reagan era of being against welfare, through to the Gingrich era of the early 90s and radicalization, and this sort of progression that led to the Trumpian era. How do you see this progression of the last 40, 50 years?
That's a pretty accurate description. Goes back to Richard Nixon, who recognized that the Republican Party could pick up Southern Democratic votes by essentially being a racist party. Didn't put it in those words, of course, but essentially by in various indirect fashions, making it clear that they opposed the civil rights movement. There had been a solid Democratic bloc of Southern Democrats. They were strongly opposed to the Johnson support for the early civil rights movement, and this was called Nixon's Southern strategy, and nothing secret about it. It was quite open. We have to recognize that the Republicans have a certain problem. Of the two political parties, they are the one that is more supportive of business rights and the very rich. And you can't approach voters saying, I want to support the very rich and the corporate world and harm you, so please vote for me. That obviously doesn't work.
No.
So you have to look for other issues, what are called cultural issues, things that are apart from the actual programs of the party. The programs of the party are very clear. Strong support for extreme wealth and corporate power. It's perfectly obvious during the Trump years. The one legislative achievement was a tax bill that benefited the extreme rich and extreme wealth, and cutback of corporate taxes, deregulation of sports business, and so on. You can't approach voters that way. So they've had to look for something else. Well, Nixon's Southern strategy was a start. In the mid-1970s, leading Republican strategist Paul Weyrich, who's a Christian nationalist, he realized that if the Republicans pretended to be opposed to abortion, I stress pretended, they could pick up the huge evangelical vote and make inroads into the Northern Catholic vote. So he proposed that to the party, and they all switched on a dime. They had mostly been what we now call pro-choice. When Reagan was governor of California in the 1960s, passed a very strong pro-choice legislation. But in the mid-70s, they all switched entirely. Reagan, George H.W. Bush, the whole slew of them. So they became pretended anti-abortions. Then the next thing was to pick up on gun rights. They're in favor of guns. They don't care one way or another, but that's the way you can pick up more votes. And so it continues. When Reagan came along, the party became pretty openly racist. Reagan himself was a dedicated racist. He wasn't pretending. So he opened his campaign, as you recall, in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a town which is known for only one thing. Civil rights workers were murdered there. The Republicans pretended it was an accident, but nobody could miss it.
Yeah.
And then came the stories about welfare queens, black, of course, stealing your money and so on. In fact, Reagan was so racist that he was the last leader in the world to support the apartheid regime in South Africa at a time when everyone else had left. Thatcher, Israel, everyone. Reagan was still supporting it. In fact, as late as 1988, it was all over by then. The Reagan administration declared the Nelson Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. And Mandela himself was on the terrorist list, couldn't visit the United States without special authorization for about 20 years until Congress finally passed some legislation about it. Well, so that's racism. Then comes Gingrich, who reconstructed the Congress, the Republican congressional delegation, so that it became kind of like the old Communist Party. It's top-down organized. Everyone has to agree. Its role is obstructionist. That became open, not even hidden under Mitch McConnell. When Obama was elected, McConnell came straight out and said, our task is to make sure he can do nothing. We've just seen that again now. McConnell's repeated the same point with Biden. We have to make sure we block him on everything, make the country ungovernable. And meanwhile, the policies of the party have changed as well. So, for example, in John McCain, when he ran in 2008, had a climate change plank in his program. Not very far-reaching, but it was there. And the Republicans in the Senate were considering climate change legislation. The Koch brothers, energy conglomerate, had been working for years to ensure that the Republicans would never veer towards recognizing global warming. And they were infuriated. They launched a huge campaign, major juggernaut, bribing senators, threatening them with primary challenges, a huge lobbying campaign, AstroTurf. The Republicans totally changed. From that point on, total climate denial. That's the way it stands today.
And Professor, on that note, I think this is a really important thing, particular for my audience, which is mostly on the left, to hear. You mentioned John McCain in contrast to some of these other wings of the right. There are some who recently, for example, when Mitt Romney voted to convict Donald Trump on one of those impeachment counts, or when Liz Cheney was removed from Republican leadership simply for saying, listen, Trump won, we have to accept that. There are some on the left who have reacted by saying, fundamentally, these people are no different than the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the most extreme of the Republican Party, while others believe, no, there is an important difference between people like McCain and Romney and those that have taken over the party now. Do you believe that the difference is a materially significant difference?
There's a difference. And McCain had, whatever you think about his policies, I didn't like him. I mean, criticized. But nevertheless, he was sort of a human being, decent human being in some ways, had some degree of integrity.
Yeah.
That's disappeared from the party. I mean, when you look at them now, they're virtually all cowering in terror before the Trump rebel. You can just see it in every act that they make, blocking the inquiry commission, the votes on the stimulus were quite interesting. The Republican Party, the legislators, know very well that their own constituents largely favored the stimulus proposals. They themselves largely support them. but they voted as a bloc uniformly against it. You have to, the highest priority is make the country ungovernable, prevent anything from happening, find a way to get back into power so we can then worship Trump and go ahead to destroy the world. I mean, Trump's climate change policies alone, forgetting everything else, another 4 years of that would probably carry us to irreversible tipping points. The game could very well be over. And if you look at the Republican base, they're caught in this trap, kind of an echo chamber trap. They hear the Republican leadership, now it's Trump worship. They turn on the Fox News, reiterates it, it's an echo chamber. Listen to Rush Limbaugh when he was alive, he tells them the same thing. Take a look at the attitudes. It's terrifying. So, for example, there was recently a Pew poll, the main polling agency, studies public attitudes. They asked people a simple question. Here they gave them 15 choices to rank as which were the urgent problems that we have to face. A split between Democrats and Republicans. Among Republicans, the lowest of the 15 was climate change. 14% thought that was a serious problem. The highest problem, greatest problem we face is illegal immigration and the deficit. The deficit became a problem on November 4th.
Indeed.
Before that, it was fine. The line was, Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. So Trump punched a huge hole in the deficit. That was fine. But November 4th, the Democrats, the deficit is the highest problem we face. And whatever you think about illegal immigration, I mean, there are problems, but it's nothing remotely like global warming, which is going to destroy organized human life on Earth. But that's 14%, the lowest of all the problems. Well, you put yourself in the position of a Republican voter, you can understand it. You hear Trump, you hear the Republican leadership, you listen to Fox News, they say it's just a liberal hoax. Maybe the Chinese are doing it. So what are you going to believe? We're faced with a really serious problem. The Republican Party has just gone off the rails. Even mainstream commentators describe them as a radical insurgency that has abandoned parliamentary politics. And you can see it in the actions, particularly since Gingrich, Hastert, McConnell, and so on.
The full interview with Noam Chomsky continues and will be posted to our YouTube channel today at youtube.com/The David Pakman Show. We will go to a break and continue right after this. The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them. Okay, let's follow up about a couple of stories from last week. As many of you know, if you watched last week, radical Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene equated wearing a mask on the floor of the House of Representatives to how Jews were killed during the Nazi Holocaust of World War II. This was a completely outrageous comment, and not even that many Republicans criticized her for it, most of them staying silent. But now she's just denying that she ever said it. She was on the Dr. Gina primetime program on Real America's Voice Network. I have no idea what that is either. And she said, really, I wasn't comparing anything to the Holocaust, and it wasn't about masks or something I don't even understand. Let's take a look at it together and see if we can figure it out.
I'm going to continue to fight back against Speaker Maskhole. That's what I call Speaker Pelosi. Speaker Maskhole and her ridiculous, tyrannical mask policies. But the biggest outrage is people being treated like second-class citizens simply because they refuse to show a passport, a vaccine passport. And I had compared it to the way, the horrible way that Jewish people had been treated by having to show their papers of who they are. Well, without a phone call or a text message, all of a sudden I find out on the news that Kevin McCarthy, Elise Stefanik, and unfortunately Steve Scalise had all condemned my remarks. And in their own condemnation of my remarks, they didn't even have it right what I had said in the first place. They were just misstating things I had said. And then also they were just preaching the woke media mob's talking points. So this is a problem. They didn't have to attack me. Nancy Pelosi doesn't attack her own. And I think the GOP needs to do better.
So what was the message you were trying to convey there?
Well, the message is this. We don't need to have Americans treated like second-class citizens simply because they don't want to get the vaccine. The vaccine is not even FDA certified yet. It hasn't been approved by the FDA, but yet we have schools like the University of Virginia telling their students that they can't return to in-person classes without getting the vaccine. Well, that's a violation of their freedoms, their rights, and their HIPAA rights. Schools and universities should not step in, especially when there's side effects being shown with these vaccines and it's not FDA approved, and people have the right to choose, especially young people that are in the lowest risk group and don't need the vaccine anyways. Most of them do not. Freedom is so precious. We have to protect it, but we can't allow the Democrats and those in charge that think they know better than us and think they can control everything that we try to do in our daily lives. We can't allow them to force us into socialism and having a tyrannical government. We have to stand up against these aggressions, and it's important that we speak out and do that.
And so you do reject the media narrative or accusation, I guess, that says you compared wearing a mask to the Holocaust. You say that's untrue. That's not at all what you meant by that.
Oh, it's completely untrue. Anyone can ask David Brody. He was interviewing me at the time when I made those statements, and I wasn't even talking about masks per se. It was talking about the mistreatment of being treated like a second-class citizen, and I never said the word Holocaust. It's just the same as I never said the words Jewish space lasers, but then the media made that one up too.
She is just so gross. I mean, just really a disgusting person. Now, of course, she did say it. Here are her original comments. Let's take a look. And you're going to notice, if you're of normal English proficiency, it's really clear what she's saying. It's really clear what she meant.
This woman is mentally ill. You know, we can look back in a time in history where people were told to wear a gold star, and they were definitely treated like second-class citizens, so much so that they were put in trains and taken to gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And this is exactly the type of abuse that Nancy Pelosi is talking about.
So she's claiming, I guess, that because in that segment we just watched, she didn't use the word Holocaust, that the entire comment really was not equating mask wearing to what was done to the Jews during the Holocaust. But Marjorie, when you talk about trains taking Jews to gas chambers in Nazi Germany, that's the Holocaust. That was during World War II. It's just what it is. Using the word Holocaust or not doesn't really make it any different. And it's also extra wacky that just a few days ago, she was defending this. She was doubling down. She was saying, yeah, I said it. And then now she said, that's not actually what I said. It's certainly not what I meant. Whether she knows this or not, this is a technique called the fire hose of falsehood. Now, it's not to be confused with gaslighting. It's related to gaslighting, but it's not exactly gaslighting. Not to be confused with the Gish Gallop. It's related to the Gish Gallop, but Gish Gallop is when you say a bunch of different things during a debate, particularly when there's limited time and it makes it difficult to refute you. The fire hose of falsehood is where you just claim different things at different opportunities. Trump did this all the time. He would take every position on an issue over a period of a few days. The issue is China. Trump would say one thing about China during a debate, and then he would say something different about China on Fox News the next day. And then he would tweet something different about China on day 3. And number one, it makes it difficult for us to suss out what is this person's actual position? What are they actually claiming? And it also makes people sort of give up on trying to figure out what the truth is because it just seems all so complicated. And then lastly, it's also a technique that increases the likelihood that anybody can find one of your positions that you like. Trump would do this, for example, on, I think this was on abortion. Remember when on abortion, I'm thinking back to 2016, he was asked, should the woman, I'm against abortion. Okay. Should the woman be punished if she gets an abortion? And he said, well, yeah, she should. And then a lot of pro-lifers love that. And then the next day he said, yeah, actually, that's not really what I meant. And so, like, no matter what your position is, you could find an instance of Trump saying something that you probably liked and just say, listen, he did say that one thing there. So I think I agree with him on this issue. And this is the sort of, this is how you weaponize disinformation. And if you remember that quote from Trump about you can't believe what you're seeing, the exact quote was, stick with us. Don't believe the crap you see from these people, the fake news. What you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening. That is the sort of full conclusion of the weaponization of disinformation, telling people even your own senses betray you. Just listen to me. Well, what if you're saying something different every 2 days? Just listen to me. It's a smart strategy when your voters are so clueless. Do and say horrible things and then pretend they never happened because it muddies up the message. And that's what Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing. They get the info out to the people they are targeting, but then they do their best to walk it back and end up suffering no repercussions. Think of it like posting retractions in a newspaper that almost nobody notices after your lead story has already had the impact you want it to have. That's what they're doing. That's what Marjorie Taylor Greene, I'm not even saying she's doing it out of a calculation, but it does work when your constituents are Marjorie Taylor Greene's constituents. All right, let me talk about something that happened over the weekend. As many of you know, when the latest Israeli-Palestinian flare-up took place, at first, for the first 4 or so days, I didn't say anything about it, feeling I didn't really have too much to add. I heard from some people respectfully who said, hey, you should talk about this. And then so I did, and I did a 20-minute segment. It's over the last month, it's the only 20-minute segment I've done, and that was a couple of weeks ago. And throughout, before I talked about it and after, the anti-Semitic comments raining down on our YouTube channel, raining down on Twitter, Instagram. I mean, we've had to block Twitch, thousands, close to 1,000 people, I would say. I don't want to exaggerate. Certainly hundreds of people on YouTube, about 100 on Twitter. Call it 600 to 800 people probably, okay, to not be hyperbolic, which is, a lot for a program our size. And even after I did the segment, the anti-Semitic comments about me being a Jew rat or all of this different stuff, they just didn't stop. And at a certain point, it sort of becomes clear that you're not really contacting me about foreign policy anymore. It's just anti-Semitism. That's really what it is. This crossed over to the real world. And over the weekend, I was out with some friends for dinner at a restaurant. And we were there sort of, a lot of things are still closing early in the Northeast because of COVID guidelines. And so there were very few people left. And as I was leaving, I walked by someone who kind of gave me a weird look. And I didn't know if it was that, I had some borscht on my face, like that one time where I did an entire show with borscht on my face and producer Pat didn't tell me, or maybe they recognized me. I didn't really know. Walk past them. And when I'm 30 feet away, I hear Pakman, and I turn around and they yell at me, you Jew Zionist imperialist. Now, I just turned and walked away. I didn't engage with it. And I think in general, what these people want is a reaction. And who knows if they plan to film me and put it on Twitter or whatever the case. But I just walked away. And what's really, obviously this is not fun, but people come up to me all the time and typically they're positive experiences. And I do a show that's public. And so to some degree, this is bound to happen. But, this was a quote left winger, right? This is not a right winger. This is an issue that it's more often the left. The right does a lot of anti-Semitism with me, but they say go back to Israel. Right. The right wing anti-Semitism is go back to Israel, a place I've been once in my life for 9 days. This was something from the left. And so I think it should be clear to all of us at this point that this is not a critique of my position, right? It's not even really an argument. As many of you know, I have more than a decade on record of being unquestionably critical of settlements, the Netanyahu administration, the urgency with which we need to find a way to lift the blockade. I'm not going to do the segment. And see, this is the problem. Why am I even talking about policy? Because this incident was not about policy. I've spoken about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really once in the last 2 years. And so Jew Zionist imperialist is not even plausibly a critique of my policy. And all sorts of things are going off here. So what do we do about something like this? I don't know. I don't really plan to do anything about it. There's a real problem with anti-Semitism on the right, and we've covered it for a really long time. We just reviewed on a recent live stream that white nationalist dude who wanted Craig Cobb, who wanted a whites only enclave in one of the Dakotas. And he was overtly anti-Semitic during our interview. And that's very clearly a right-wing anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, there's a left-wing anti-Semitism as well. And even by talking about this, there's going to be even more that's hurled at me. And some people are going to write and say, well, it's not anti-Semitism, David, because you are a Zionist. And as I've always said before, what do you even mean by that term? Every time I've been confronted with it, I never really get a straight answer. And what I've said before is, if what you're asking me is, do I think that the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is no more Israel? No, I don't think that's the solution. Much like the solution is not no Palestinian state, right? I think the solution is an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. Does that make me a Zionist? Because otherwise it's never anything we're able to actually figure out. But hurling Jew Zionist imperialists to someone, on the street is over the line. It's not a policy critique. I don't know what else to say about it. But if the left goes too far in this direction, it's not going to be good. And as I said before, it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive because every time Jewish folks hear about not what happened to me was not violent, wasn't physically violent, but the videos we saw from Los Angeles, New York, etc. More and more American Jews or Jews wherever they're being harassed in France say, wow, I really may need to move to Israel someday. And they disengage from holding Israel accountable for the things Israel does wrong. So not only do I think it's ugly and disgusting, it's also counterproductive to what most of these leftists claim to want. I think that's all I really feel the need to say about it. Maybe something I'll follow up on at some point in the future, but really ugly stuff. Unbecoming of the left. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a great question about the origins of anti-vaxxerism. Take a listen.
Hi, David. My name's Caitlin, and I'm from Florida, and I have a question for you about vaccine hesitancy.
Yes.
So in rare Florida fashion, I have a mom who is a Trumper and an anti-vaxxer and happens to think that since I'm on the pre-med track, I need to be wary of the mark of the beast and getting microchipped with a vaccine. So obviously she's not very fond of the idea of getting the COVID-19 vaccine, although the majority of her family members have already gotten the vaccine and are doing just fine. So I wanted to know your opinion on where you think all of this anti-vax sentiment originated. Like, is there just some point in history where this kind of became really prevalent in the United States?
Yeah. So listen, so Mark of the Beast specifically is a Christian thing. So Mark of the Beast is based on particular Christian teachings. I don't know what they are. I don't really care, but that's that. The origin, the first real big anti-vaccine movement was in England around smallpox. So you had the anti-vaccination leagues. There were some who had religious objections to the smallpox vaccine, some who had what they claimed to be scientific objections, some had political objections, and that's the origin in England. Now, in the United States, I believe it was in the early 1900s, like 1902, 1903. There was a smallpox outbreak, and you had the Board of Health in Cambridge, Massachusetts, mandate vaccination for all residents. And some people went absolutely nuts. And there were similar arguments. There were so-called medical arguments made. There were religious arguments made. There were political freedom arguments made. So you had that. And then you just saw basically repetitions of that. In the mid 70s, with the DTP, diphtheria, tetanus pertussis vaccine, you had a similar kind of controversy. Many of you might remember in the late 90s, there was the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella controversy, and Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who was disbarred or deboarded, I don't know what it would be called, who claimed that there was a connection between autism and the MMR vaccine. So then that built it up further. And then now, the thing now is that it's the perfect storm because of the right-winger insanity on COVID. You basically weaponize the pre-existing ignorance and conspiracism of Trump supporters, and it's now being applied heavily to the COVID vaccine. So it's like the perfect storm. But those are the origins, and it goes back quite a ways, and it's absolutely horrifying. We have a great bonus show for you today. I won't even tell you it'll be a surprise. It's just a great bonus show. Sign up at joinpakman.com. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman.